we'd like to welcome David Beerling, Professor David Beerling from the University of Sheffield. He's an expert on enhanced rock weathering. That's the subject of today's Talking Heads. He heads up the Leverhulme Centre, which is studying the climate mitigation potential of enhanced rock weathering. And he also leads the greenhouse gas removals demonstrator on enhanced rock weathering. So there's no better person to talk to about enhanced rock weathering than David. So welcome, David. My first question, thank you. My first question is, can you just tell us in simple terms what enhanced rock weathering is and how it works?
Sure. So in the simplest way to think about it is you're basically amending agricultural soil with a crushed silicate rock, usually basalt, which is a very common volcanic rock. And then as that crushed rock is applied to the soil, it interacts with the soil chemistry and also the roots of the crops. And they help to break down, and the microbes, and they help to break down the silicate rocks, releases cations, which are basically calcium and magnesium ions. And then those ions are then go on to capture carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate, which drains out of the soil, across the land surface into the ocean, where it's stored for 10,000 years or so.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, that is amazing. So how does enhanced rock weathering actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere?
Sorry. So yeah, so the way it works is as the silicate rocks contain calcium and magnesium ions, and then as those are ripped out of the sort of mineral lattices, then they're positively charged ions, cations. And then once they go into solution, the laws of physics say they have to be counterbalanced by a negatively charged ion, which in our case is bicarbonate, which is basically CO2 dissolved in water. So once they're released by weathering, then they're charge balanced by these bicarbonate ions, and that's your CO2 in soluble form, which then drains down through the soil profile and makes its way to the sea, where it's stored for a long time.
So we're adding this crushed rock to agricultural soils, but why do we add to agricultural soils? Does it have any impact on plant growth, soil quality, or anything like that?
Yeah, so good question. So one of the issues with intensification of agriculture is that it's degraded our soils. It's made them more acidic, and it's also depleted the soils in some of the key micronutrients that are important for maintaining crop production. And as the basalt weathers, it produces alkalinity that can reverse soil acidification. And it also, as it breaks down, it also releases these micronutrients that are important for crop health. So things like, for example, silica and other nutrients that can support growing healthy crops. And that allows, theoretically at least, it allows the application of the basalt to increase yields. And well, yeah, so in addition to these other micronutrients, it also has important elements for fertilizers like phosphorus and potassium. So these are fertilizer nutrients that can then stimulate yields. And in our large-scale field trials in the US, we found over 4 years that we get an increase in maize yields, sort of 10%, and an increase in soybean yields of even more, about 15%. So it's very encouraging in terms of being one of these technologies that can capture carbon and also increase yields and improve soil. So these sort of win-wins associated with it.
That's so interesting. Once it's in the soil, does it interact with soil organic matter? And if so, how is that? What's the relationship between the two?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So most soils are quite acidic, and actually trying to measure changes in soil organic matter over time is particularly tricky. You normally need quite long-term field trials or experiments to try and understand that. What we found is that in some cases you see an increase in organic matter, carbon, soil organic carbon, and in some cases you see no change. So there is kind of, there's a good sort of theoretical expectation for why you might expect an increase, because as these cations are released, then they form special complexes which bind in organic matter. but it's quite difficult to detect those over, over short timescales. So I think that's kind of an open question that people are still working on, that we need longer term trials on to really rigorously address.
Yeah, so some of them are showing positive impacts on soil carbon levels, soil organic carbon levels, and some none. Have you been able to determine the relationship? I mean, what's causing that? Is it dependent on soil type? Is it dependent on the acidity? Is it dependent on what's growing? Do we know that yet, or is it just still an open question?
I think that's still an open question. So there's been some work done on a mineral called wollastonite, a very fast-weathering mineral called wollastonite, on forests in China, where we've seen an increase in organic matter through these metal organic matter complexes. Then when we've looked in the US, we don't see any increase in soil organic matter in these US soils in the Corn Belt. And neither do we see an increase in soil respiration, which would be indicative of the loss of carbon as a result of the treatment. So I guess you could say in the US so far we've seen no change. In forests in China, commercial rubber forests in China, we've seen small increases. So it's a tricky field it's a tricky measurement to make accurately.
Interesting. All good for us soil scientists. Good work for us in the future.
Absolutely.
Over to you, Ellie.
Yeah, I was wondering in terms of, what it is, where it comes from, what are the sources, and are they sort of easily available for the silicate rock that's needed?
Yeah, so there are sort of various candidate silicate rocks that are on the table for people to think about using for enhanced weathering. I think probably the lead one is basalt. It's the most abundant surface rock in the world. It's extensively mined around the world for aggregates and road building. And it also has, besides these cations that are important for capturing carbon, it also has these other elements that, as I said, can support improving soil health and support yields. Another one is wollastonite, which I mentioned, which is fast weathering, but which is great, but it doesn't have these extra micronutrients. And in terms of sort of the global picture, there aren't really, the billions of tons of reserves that you'd need to kind of really have a significant impact. But, on the other hand, let's figure out which rocks work best where, rather than put all our, rather than narrow our options too soon, I would say.
And when you see it, when you see it used, is it usually coming from local sources generally, or at the moment is it an industry where certain countries are ahead and they're exporting it? How does that look?
Yeah, so in the US, for example, and in the UK, when companies quarry for basalt, about 20% of that rock is too fine to be used for aggregate or building. So they basically stockpile it, or even occasionally use it for asphalt. And so in the US, there's various enhanced weathering companies that have then sprung up and decided they're going to exploit these stockpiles of crushed rock. And then what they do is optimize the allocation of those rocks to nearby farmlands to minimize the transport distance. And so what they've really got is a nice system that is a ready supply of finely ground rock that doesn't have to be mined or ground, and a minimal transport distance to get it onto the cropland area, so they maximize CDR and lower their costs. So in the US, that works quite well. And, that's why I imagine several companies have sprung up there. Similar sort of thing in Brazil, I think, as well, where they actively mine basalt and have a lot of croplands and really ideal climates for driving weathering and carbon dioxide removal. In the UK, it's a similar thing, but we do have active basalt quarrying companies in Northumbria and Scotland, and they are stockpiling this stuff. And now more and more companies are realizing actually this is a valuable resource. A bit awkwardly for the UK, most of the basalt is in Northumbria and Scotland, and then you've got all the croplands down the sort of northeast coast. So it's not ideally located. But there are deposits in Wales, so there's like growing interest in Wales in deploying it with trees, actually, reforestation with trees as well as with croplands. So each country, I think, has to solve its own, find its own way of optimizing how to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. That's so interesting.
So this sounds like a really promising technology, a technology or an option for greenhouse gas removal and to improve the soils. As we upscale it, are there any environmental risks or trade-offs we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I think you have to be, you have to be cognizant of the possible pros and cons of any kind of technology like this. On the ground, I would say we have to be careful that there are no environmental health risks associated with this. You're basically applying a crushed natural rock, but you definitely want to track whether there's any trace metal accumulation in the soils or the edible parts of the crops, for example. That's crucial. You also want to try and understand what are the potential effects on biodiversity, by influencing not only floristic biodiversity, but microbial biodiversity in the soil. And then I think more generally, there are concerns or, there are potential issues around trying to understand public acceptability of increasing outputs from mines. And again, I think, as with sourcing the material, I think it varies between different countries. Different countries have their own challenges. When you speak to people in the UK, very much there's a feeling that, oh, it's a NIMBY approach, not in my backyard. We don't want to crank out more basalt from our quarries. When you speak to people in the US, they're like, oh, it's no big deal. We can just up the output. So there's kind of varying, and similarly in Australia, where they have a very extensive coal mining industry down the east coast. There's very extensive basalt deposits there as well. And so the question then is, would it be a big deal to increase output from the basalt mines there? So, it's sort of a country by country basis.
Yeah, so different cultural perceptions on mining basically are feeding into that.
Yeah, and obviously in Australia, there's the sort of indigenous land rights as well that you have to be mindful of.
Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of if you, if you're a farmer and you're interested in getting involved, what are the main costs associated with the practice? And are you seeing sort of different sectors having different specific costs to consider?
Yeah, so I think, one of the kind of curious features of enhanced weathering as a kind of business model is that all the costs are really upfront. So you need to buy the basalt and you need to cover the transportation costs and the application costs of the rock dust. And then as it starts to weather and you capture carbon, then the payback comes over time. So these commercial companies that have sprung up are really funded through prepaid carbon removal purchases. And then what they do is use the funds that they've raised to pay farmers to apply and transport and apply the rock dust. And then as it starts to capture carbon, then they can sell those carbon credits and recover their money. So I think, in terms of, for example, how it might work in the UK, I think you would need government policies or subsidies in a way that's going to help farmers with the initial deployment. And then once they've got a kind of procedure or national labs that can then analyze soils to determine how much carbon they could capture, they could then, sell those carbon credits on a carbon removal platform.
That's so interesting. So it's in other countries, are you seeing it already incorporated into sort of green finance structures in a kind of regulated way?
I think it's sort of not quite there yet. I think there's an active group in the US that wants to have it part of the Farm Bill, as part of the Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. If you could actually have enhanced weathering as a carbon removal agricultural technique, and recognized by the Farm Bill, potentially you're looking at billions of dollars flowing into the sector, which would be, transformative. And in the EU, on the sort of European side, I think enhanced weathering has just been accepted in carbon trading certificates. So again, that, it's very early days, but that could also ultimately prove to be transformative. The UK government is more circumspect. Naturally, they want to see more evidence. And that's really where our UKRI demonstrators coming in. We're trying to build evidence of how it performs in the field, what the social acceptability is of it, and also, what are the resources and the environmental impacts.
Very interesting. Thanks.
It's a really promising technology, obviously, David, but we don't see many farmers around the place using it yet. So what are the main barriers to uptake, both now and going forward into the future as we try to upscale this technology?
Yeah, so there are farmers in Northumbria and Scotland and Wales that are already using it. I think part of it is we need to grow the evidence base to get it out there. People are kind of much more aware of biochar, for example. So I think we need to kind of build the evidence base for enhanced weathering. And so this, building that scientific foundation is absolutely crucial, I think. Once people see, or if ultimately the evidence shows that it can improve soils and yields and capture carbon, then you could see it start to take off. But until people see that, then they're much more reticent. Or having said that, every time we publish a paper and do a press release, I'm inundated with farmers that have read about it in The Guardian that say, how do we get involved? Sounds great. So I think in a sense, once the evidence is out there, we might be pushing at an open door, but we do need to figure out the funding model about how it's going to work. And, at the moment, the quarries are providing basalt extremely cheaply, and we just have to cover transportation costs for our field trials. But ultimately, for farmers to do this, they're going to need some kind of financing mechanism that enables it to scale.
Yeah, and presumably the quarries will wise up and realise that this is a commodity that's got value.
That's right. Yeah,
Go up.
absolutely.
So we talked a bit about the cost to farmers, but I mean, what are the main sort of costs in I presume you had to crush the rock. Is that a main energy cost and financial cost? Is that or is it transportation?
Yeah, I think because we've been using sort of stockpiles, crushed rock, the main costs for us and probably farmers as well is transportation costs. And you could imagine future decades as we electrify our transportation network, that those are going to come down. But right now, that's the main cost.
Yeah. And just finally, how does enhanced rock weathering compare to other technologies that are available for greenhouse gas removal, like soil carbon sequestration, growing trees, peatland restoration, biochar?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's important to say that no one carbon dioxide removal technology will help any particular nation get to net zero. We're going to need a whole suite of them. I think, as we talked about earlier, one of the benefits of this is that there are these wins for soils and food security that you don't see if you're going to grow bioenergy crops, for example, which are going to use cropland area for food for growing bioenergy crops. And similarly with direct air capture, it's very expensive to build direct air capture plants. And then you've got to build the infrastructure where you compress the CO2 and transport it in pipelines, inject it on the seafloor, then monitor the seafloor, make sure it doesn't bubble back out. So that kind of thing. Then on the sort of more nature-based solutions, it can work with reforestation, for example. There's some very nice trials going on in mid Wales where they've been doing enhanced weathering with reforestation, so it can work synergistically with that. It could also potentially work synergistically with biochar, although we need more work on understanding those interactions. And yeah, so I think it's very promising. We do need to be mindful of the environmental impacts, and yeah, overall, I think that the picture is positive, but we do need more research to understand it, how it operates properly in the field.
David, what do we know about the lag times, about the dissolution of these ions in the soil?
Yeah, so one of the sort of hot topics of enhanced weathering at the moment is really trying to understand what the potential lag times is between rates of dissolution and delivery of your carbon dioxide removal. So you can get quite good rates of weathering of your minerals in the soil profile, but then as those cations come off the minerals as they weather, they can stick in the soils, so exchanges in the soils, and hang on there until those exchanges are full before they start to be released and charge balance into the soil water. And so there's a whole active area of trying to do this in sort of process-based modeling. And current indications are, it varies between soils. It depends on the cation exchange capacity of your soils. If you've got sandy soils, then the lag times are very low, maybe a few years. If you've got very clay-rich soils with a high cation exchange capacity, then it could be a decade or more before we see that. And so it's going to vary with soils and vary with climate. So the more rainfall, for example, faster the flushing of the soils, and the more likely you're going to get to shorter lag times.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Well, talking about rainfall, I was wondering, and this interview is for the Land Use for Net Zero UK initiative. When you think about land use, different topographies, different regions, different soil types, different land uses, have you seen evidence that this technology works better in some places, regions, just general kind of inherent characteristics of a place that you would want, I guess, policymakers to be thinking about when they're considering it?
Sure, at the global scale, we know that basically enhanced weathering works best in the tropics. The weathering of the minerals is temperature dependent, so the warmer the temperature, the faster the rate of dissolution. But then also you need high rainfall as well, because that rainfall then flushes the soils, so it removes the reaction products, allows the weathering to go faster. And we've seen really fast rates of weathering in the tropics in our oil palm systems and also in our sugarcane systems, for example. So there is, in a sense, there's an opportunity here for climate justice. That countries in the global south or developing countries have an opportunity for deploying this technology on soils that are already acidic in the perfect environment for carbon capture, independently of anything that nations in developed nations might think about.
That's so interesting. And so you've talked quite a lot about kind of it gets permeated through the soil profile with water. If you're looking at agricultural soils, do you have to consider soil structure ahead of application? Is that a consideration that the water is actually going to get through? I mean, sometimes that's an issue for certain parts of the UK in terms of surface flooding, etc., from compaction.
So I think you would like, in an ideal world, you'd like slightly acidic soils that are well drained. You wouldn't apply it to alkaline soils, for example, or peaty soils. So you'd really focus on the UK is kind of blessed, if that's the right word, with large amounts.
So, David, I was wondering whether, if you think about different topographies, different regions, different soil types, different land uses, those kind of more innate characteristics, is there anywhere that you can kind of think about your land use planning in terms of where your big wins are, where maybe not to invest with this, and where the big opportunities might be?
Yeah, so in the UK at least, you'd want to focus on, or generally you want to focus on acidic soils that are well draining, because those are highly suitable, that are located near to major areas of basalt mining. So sort of northeast coast of the UK and Scotland, including Scotland, would be ideal places to start doing this. Whereas, you wouldn't necessarily want to transport it down to southeast where it's drier and you have long transport distances from your source rock areas.
Brilliant, thanks. So, if you were describing the actual process of application to somebody who knew absolutely nothing about it, how does it work? How do you actually apply it to soils?
So the way that we've done it on our large-scale field trials and academic commercial farms is basically just to use standard fertilizer spreading equipment. And so you kind of surface dress it through a hopper. And then if you've got like a bioenergy crop, then you just leave it and it becomes worked in by sort of physical and biological processes. If it's arable land, then it can be surface tilled with discs or chisel ploughed to incorporate it into the surface layer of the soil.
Brilliant, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your vast expertise and experience with us, David. It's been really useful and really excellent for everyone to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invite. Pleasure to talk about our work.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. It's been fascinating. And we'll add this onto our newly growing library of talking heads on some of these critical issues around soil health and carbon dynamics for the land use and net zero initiative. And this is definitely one that I think is going to get a lot of attention. So thanks so much.